We try to understand trends, but there's so much contingency about everyday life, and there's so much that relies on personal family history, class, one's economic experience, one's ability as a student, and that's what I try to capture in this book. But that really struck me in that work, in that first project. And this real passion for education, which is not unique to Jordan in any way. But because this was a small town in which education had come later than it had in other parts of the country, just this real belief amongst people who are really struggling that education was the key. And a belief that still drives many people's efforts to command as many resources as they can and to struggle against really insurmountable odds sometimes to ensure that their children get educated, even when there's plenty of evidence that that actually may not lead to the upward mobility that they're hoping for. And this is tied to a lot of the kind of larger political events in the region today. But I was just struck with how much hope people had in education, and there's a possibility for education for their sons and daughters. And the last part is just sort of how similar a girls' high school, I was in a girls' high school, felt to my own experience in high school. And I'll talk about that. And so on the one hand, this is a very different place, a different history, but there were so many moments in which it felt so familiar. And I'll talk more about that. And I went to an all-girls high school, and I should say that all the schools are sex segregated after 5th grade in Jordan. And my work was in public schools, girls' secondary public schools, and that's why I did my research. So after this initial experience, I went back and did an academic year, 9 months in a girls' high school in a city of about 60,000 people, an hour from the capital, and then interviewed members of 15 families who had young women in these schools, and then sort of subsequent visits and interviews with these young women. In addition to that, I did follow up with students over time. I did a lot of look at policy and sort of state discourse about education. And in the course of the school-based research, I did observation, interviewing, I taught a couple of different versions of English conversation. So there are many ways in which I sort of engaged with these young women at the school. So this just gives you a sense of the research that led to this book, which was my doctoral dissertation, expanded. So I did 3 subsequent visits after the doctoral work, where I went and followed up with a handful of these families, and there are a number of the young women who were in high school in 2005 who I'm still in contact with and are in some ways connected to new research that I'm doing as well. So I wanted to think about schooling in Jordan, and I do think about schooling more broadly on multiple levels. On the one hand, as I said already, thinking about schools as this important social space, right? A space in which young women who, particularly in the community in which I was working, didn't really have much access to other public spaces, and the space was somewhat public, right, the school. And so thinking about what that space meant in their day-to-day lives in terms of the kinds of things that they were learning about being women, about the state, about any number of things. So the importance of this space in the lives of young women. And then thinking about schools as state institutions and the full implications of that. And I'll talk more about that momentarily. And then thinking about schools or education as this kind of discursive project of international development, and very intimately linked with our ideas about women's development in the world. So I was thinking about that, the way in which we development and development institutions and policies frame education and link it to women's development in the Arab world. And then finally, what I've already mentioned, education as hope and expectation, and as very much a communal project, a family project. So these are the layers, the levels at which I tried to study the school. So beginning with the actual physical space of the school, instead of thinking about the other arenas or the other levels at which we can think about school and education. And so, I actually should have this slide out while I was saying that. So schools as local spaces, state institutions, international development projects, and also ideas about development, and then expectations. So the book itself and my work is kind of organized around thinking. So I said I was interested in the school as a state institution, and that's threaded through the entire book. But there's one particular segment of the book in which I think about patriotic education, nationalism, and the ways in which the state is engaged in trying to promote particular ideas, promote loyalty. And the second piece is thinking about religion and Islam and how young people and teachers are are learning about Islam in school. Respectable women, so the ways in which gender, I talk about them as gender lessons, or the ways in which young women are learning about gender in school. And then finally, the kind of hopes and expectations that are tied to education. How is that being conveyed in school? Education for what questions? Where is education meant to take these young women? What do they think? What do their teachers think? What do their families think? So what I want to do is just kind of take each one of those themes and say a little bit about the core kind of issues I focused in on in the text, and then just read what I think are some of the more interesting passages related to these themes. So on the performing patriotism piece, I mean, clearly these are public schools in a largely authoritarian state. I mean, it's a monarchy in the full sense of the word. And although often here in the United States we don't think about Jordan as authoritarian, there's sort of degrees of authoritarianism, but it's essentially a monarchy, and the monarchy leads the country and has all the kind of executive and legislative power. And so it's a state. Schools, like anywhere else, are a very important part of the state project, and it's a relatively new state. And some of the historical work that's been done on Jordan looks at the ways in which schools were critical in trying to establish a link between the Hashemites, this is the royal family, who came from Saudi Arabia, and were given this land by the British to create a state. So Jordan really, as a country, didn't really exist prior to the 1920s, and then only became an independent state in the 50s, and the Hashemites were given this land by the British. And so the state project was very much about creating that link between the Hashemite regime and the state, and trying to instill loyalty in the local population. And particularly in the 50s and 60s, that was a very contentious project. And teachers and students were key kind of, teachers were quite politicized in that era. And Arab nationalists and leftist politics was quite rampant through schools in the 50s and 60s. And so some of the greatest challenges to the state's legitimacy came from schools in that era. And at the same time, the state was trying to exert its control. So, bringing us back more to the present, I think there's been a lot of interesting work by anthropologists of education, sociologists of education, that sort of challenge the notion of some state control of school and what does that really mean. Trying to examine the ways in which teachers, students respond to a state narrative, respond to ideas about nationalism and identity in the everyday context of school. In the scholarship on the Middle East, this has been largely absent. The state is often, because of the reliance on textbook and policy, oftentimes the research, or the majority of the research, really sort of accepts the state as in control. And there's been very little attempt to try and understand how this unfolds in school, and how people might be reacting to the state narrative. And so in my text, I look at the sort of everyday ways, less the curriculum and more the everyday kind of patriotic events, because there are public ways in which the students are engaged regularly in displaying patriotism. I mean, there's sort of a morning assembly that starts out with Hail to the King. Every morning, the first thing the kids do is line up and sing Hail to the King, which is essentially the national anthem in Jordan, Hail to the King. And then, there are a number of other there's an more Arab nationalist kind of song. And so I look at these moments, I look at sort of, there's an incident in which inspectors from the Minister of Education come to inspect this morning assembly and reprimand the students for not singing with enough emotion. And I talk about what do these sort of moments mean in terms of how successful this patriotic education is. What was also quite fascinating to me is that in this city in which I was at the public events for national holidays, so Army Day, the King's Birthday, Independence Day, students would perform at these patriotic events. And in my experience in this city, the performers were always female. So they would have at the municipal hall, all the students, boys and girls coming from different schools to attend Army Day event. But all the students on the stage were female, whether they were reading poetry, whether they were singing, nationalistic patriotic songs, they were always female. And when you ask people why that was, they'd say, well, boys don't like doing these things, or they'd say girls are better at this, girls are easier to work with. And you hear this, I remember reading a book about Bolivia, a text on Bolivia, the author's name I'm blanking on right now. But, sorry? Lux, yeah. And she talks about the same thing, that girls are often the ones performing in these events, and the teachers say they're easier to work with. So there's definitely there was this sentiment that this was not in any sense a deliberate thing, that the girls would be performing, but that this was just what came to be because of the boys' own interests. But what was very interesting is what regardless of the intent, what the young women can represent, right? Because there are two sort of things that they can represent, or they did represent. On the one hand, sort of having young women up, and here's in that picture actually, these are the young women practicing. They're in a music group at my high school, and they're practicing for King Day celebration. And that's the king's picture in the center, and that's his father on one side, his grandfather on the other side. And so the young women in the music group would meet regularly in the course of the school day, and they would practice for these events. And the music group almost exclusively did patriotic events. So on the one hand, sort of having young women on stage fits very much with a state narrative and a state desire to present itself as modern, and women sort of being an indicator of that modernity. So the idea that we have women out there, they're singing, they're presenting, is very much part of the narrative that the royal family even has tried to promote, and women in the royal family try to promote it. And we have very sort of active and out there women in the royal family who are engaged in charity work or even sometimes in political work. And so in that sense, this is very continuous with that image, the sort of public performance of these young women. And they're quite strong, it's very articulate. What was interesting was that in the school, there were quite a number of objections made about their participation in these events by teachers and students. Some of the objections were academic, because these young women were basically being pulled out of class to prepare. So even though this was an extracurricular activity, it was happening in the course of the day. So teachers felt like they were jeopardizing their own studies and academics by participating in this group. And some of the objections were more about sort of the morality and appropriateness, the respectability of participating in these events. Should women? So some of the teachers would object directly to these girls. Actually, they'd say, you shouldn't be up there dancing and singing in front of men, or you shouldn't be up there without your hair covered. And so these are the kinds of discussions that would be raised. And for me, this was, and I would talk to the young women about this, and we'd go back and forth, and the young women would defend, and oftentimes they agreed with what the teachers were saying, but they'd say, but these are patriotic events, so it's different. This is respectable kind of performance because it's patriotic. And they try to distinguish it from another kind of musical performance, which they saw as less legitimate. But for me, what was interesting as a researcher is, how does this kind of debate within the school challenge what the state's trying to accomplish with these patriotic events? Not explicitly necessarily, but implicitly. Because when these events are being criticized, it's sort of the moral legitimacy of these events that are being challenged. And sort of indirectly, the moral legitimacy of the Ministry of Ed and the state who's saying that young women should do these things. And so this is the way, one of the ways in which I like to think about these events, and a number of other events where the state has to enforce patriotic events, like enforce enthusiasm in the morning assembly. So when you have someone at the Ministry of Education yelling at students saying, you are singing your national anthem, you must sing with enthusiasm, how does this index the weakness of the state and the strength of the state at the same time? So it's sort of the everyday ways in which you can see that struggle over legitimacy happening. And I thought the patriotic events were really quite strong in the ways they were able to convey this. And I'll just read one passage related to this. Let's see. Okay, just one passage. So I was talking so the king's birthday is sometime in January. It was late February, and they announced that they were going to have an event for the king's birthday. And I very innocently, they were talking about this occasion. I said, oh, wasn't the king's birthday a few weeks ago? And they said, and I was sitting in an office with a number of staff people and a teacher. And so one staff person said to me, yes, but each government takes turns celebrating, and it's our turn this week. So we'll have a parade and all the students will march. And then the school secretary, Bashira, said, all the girls, so she's speaking to this other staff person, all the girls have to participate, we can't send all of them out. They won't be willing to go anyway. They'll say their parents won't allow it. And then so I asked her, I said, so what do you do in this case if the girls say they don't want to participate? And the secretary says, well, actually we know which girls are telling the truth because we know their families, and some of them are just lying to try and get out and marching. We have these marches frequently. Last spring we had a march in support of the king after a terrorist plot was uncovered in Jordan and the suspects were arrested. The king gave a speech after these events, and the march was to show support for him. So Leah, a teacher, says, families usually don't have a problem with their daughters participating. They collaborate, and we collaborate with the wider society. We all work together. So I asked her who calls for such marches, and she said the Ministry of Education in Amman was to call out to the local ministries. And the person who actually come and announced this event was someone from the local ministry. And at this point, he got quite uncomfortable with the conversation, and he left. I think he thought I was asking too many questions. But so then tomorrow, another teacher says, there'll be an event at the municipal hall to celebrate the King's birthday too. The Ministry of Education here calls us up and then asks us to send students. And then she asked me, do you have similar celebrations and holidays in the U.S.? I said, yeah, we do, but it's less than here, or maybe less overt. Although I have a footnote where I say maybe I wasn't being quite accurate there in my characterization of the U.S. now that I have children in school here. But anyway, so I said yes, we do, but less than here, or maybe it's less overt. And tomorrow, another teacher says to me, so you have progressed. You're past the phase of singing and dancing. So there was this interesting way in which no one ever really criticized these events, but they'd say things like this, like you're past the phase of singing and dancing. Because it was quite mechanical, this process. All right, we have to take the students out again. And it doesn't mean that there weren't people who really felt loyalty to the state. But some people felt really almost disrespected by this. You must go out and march tomorrow, but why not that? So she said, so you're past the phase of singing and dancing. And my footnote, I should say, because it's funny, is shortly after my daughter started kindergarten, she came home one day, she made a flag out of paper and a pencil, and she said, everybody march after me. And she marched around our living room. And so I said, this is the flag. This is the flag. And then, we need to sort of objectify our own society. So it clearly wasn't, I still don't see the overt kind of patriotic education as pervasive here, but I feel like so much of what young children learn when they enter the public school system is patriotism. It's the Pledge of Allegiance, it's patriotic songs, and so I was really struck by this is the flag march around. But in any event, so these are the kind of issues that I take up in thinking about patriotism. It's less, I do talk a little bit about civic education curriculum, but it's more about these performances, because these performances really were rich in the ways in which they brought up these kinds of questions, often implicitly, occasionally with a snide remark like, you're still singing and dancing, but in a context in which people generally do not feel comfortable critiquing the regime, if they even had critiques, and this has changed significantly just in the past 2 years, it was much more implicit. So the other area that I think about is religious education. And when I started this research, I didn't say I'm going to study Islamic education, I'm going to study patriotic education. I just these were the spheres in which there was lots of interesting discussion and debate. And this is so I sort of gravitated to particular classes and talked to particular teachers. And what really struck me about religious education is just how much of it was happening in so many different spaces. Like, so above and beyond religion class, people were just talking to each other, asking questions. And in this school, there was a young student in 11th grade who was quite, I thought of her as like kind of an in-school preacher. She was very active in a religious group outside of school, and she was preaching to her classmates all of the time. And what was really interesting is this dynamic that emerged between her and a religion teacher who was very popular in the school, Miss Suhed. So Amina, who was the student involved in a piety movement outside of school, and I forgot that you shared this. It's actually her student name. So Amina, who was this in-school preacher, she was the head of the prayer room committee. They had a prayer room, but then she created this committee. They would have religious lessons at lunchtime. She, at any opportunity, she'd answer a question in class and then would speak for 15 minutes and give sort of her, really calling, she was doing what we would call in Arabic dawah, right? So calling people to be better Muslims, like through her own perspective of what dawah is. And in the group she was involved with was quite conservative, even by the local standards of this community, right? In terms of their interpretation. And so she was often criticizing her classmates for the way they dressed, for listening to music, for any number of things that in her perspective were un-Islamic. And so there was a very popular religion teacher, Ms. Suhed, who never directly talked about Amina, but was clearly in conversation with her all of the time. Because she would say, some people in this school tell you that you can't wear a pink headscarf. They say you should only wear gray and black, or is that something to that effect? And she'd say, that's not true. God loves beautiful things. And she would have this debate, and they would, and so she never talked about Amina, but for Ms. Suhed, who was a very religious woman herself, she saw her role as sort of dissuading, sort of speaking against what she saw as traditional attitudes that had infiltrated religion. And so, so she had her idea of what proper religion was, and she thought that Amina reflected the sort of corruption of that, and an unintellectual kind of religious education. And so she was regularly engaging with Amina and folks like Amina, who she saw sort of the surrounding, she often framed it as traditional people, tradition of the community, and she was also sort of often speaking against them. And she was really quite, why was Ms. Mohan so popular? She had these really progressive ideas about pedagogy compared to all of the other teachers at the school. She had read about these things. She asked me to get her a book on emotional intelligence. She was working on a PhD herself for education. And she did things like role plays and skits in the classroom. So the kids loved it because it was a nice change from what they were accustomed to in the classroom. And she really had this belief that it was her duty to bring her students to religion and to the right interpretation of religion, but that one needed to do this in sort of a smart way. Needed to do it by engaging young people, by teaching them to come to that point through their own kind of reflection on religion. And she was, she was quite explicit about this because she was studying about pedagogy. She was reading texts about it. And, but she was just considered to be a fun teacher, a teacher you could engage with, a class that you would be, you would have more fun in. In contrast to her, there was a younger and new religion teacher in the school named Miss Jude. And Miss Jude was a very new teacher. So she had left school after high school and gotten married and had recently gone back to school, and she was a substitute teacher. And Miss Jude was much more by the book. And I guess this is one of the things that I really focus on in the book, too, is that, yes, there is a religious curriculum. There are a variety of kinds of things taught in that religious curriculum. And the teachers have to teach it because that's what the students are tested on. But in Ms. O'Hale's class, for example, there was so much more that happened. And often she'd start with a religious lesson from the textbook, but she'd expand and relate it to any number of things that she thought were important for the young women to think about in their own lives. So the textbooks was just a sort of tiny piece of what happened in her class. Ms. Jude, I thought of as a much more kind of by-the-book religion teacher. She followed the text more closely. And she was also sort of less willing to entertain different interpretations. There was less discussion in her class. But even in Ms. Jude's case, there was lots of sort of pushing back from the students and sort of, trying to push her to answer questions, or even just sort of playing around and fooling around in the class. And I really focus on this because on the surface, Ms. Jude seems stricter, more rigid, but she's a substitute teacher. She's not that confident as a teacher. And the students are giving her a hard time sometimes, but they also like her because she's nice. So there are these interesting spaces that are opened up in the classroom that even in the case of Ms. Jude, who very much more follows the book and doesn't encourage the same kind of more open-ended pedagogy or discussion in class, there are moments in which the students sort of just push her to go in different directions, and I'll just give one example. So they were doing a lesson on moderation in Islam, and so the text, the teacher reads from the textbook, which says, God made the Islamic community the best community, distinguished with its law, and it made this community moderate. What is moderation? And this is how the passage of the text ends. And so Ms. Jude then goes on to talk about this passage and to talk about moderation. What does it mean to be moderate in one's faith? So, and she asked him, what does moderation in Islam mean? And so one of the students, Ibtisam, raises her hand and she says, you shouldn't just pray all the time and do nothing else. Ms. Jude said, yes, and you need to take care of your body. And Islam makes adjustments for these physical limitations. So, for example, a traveler doesn't have to fast. And then she goes on and gives other examples. And then she said, we should also show moderation in other ways. We should show respect for our teachers and not overdo our friendliness. It's overdoing it when you start calling teachers by nicknames like Tutu. And then, so Miss Jude so Lena says, Miss, that means you would be Juju. And so there's just this kind of like, even though she's being very serious with them, and she's trying to use this to say, you should be respecting me because she's having a hard time with crowd control, classroom control, because she's a new teacher. So, but what was even funnier then is that shortly after this, another student gets up. She goes to throw something in the trash, and she walks by Miss Jude, and she goes over and squeezes her cheek like this. I'm absolutely shocked that she's just done this. It's, quite kind of disrespectful. I mean, she's trying to be friendly and cute about it, so she comes up, because they just did this Juju tutu thing, so I think that this student thinks that this is cute at this point. It was absolutely shocking to me. But then I thought to myself, I say this is absolutely shocking to you, but then I thought to myself, we did stuff like this all the time in school, maybe not quite like this. So on the one hand, this is a very different context, and the students are really struggling with debates about religion that really are bigger than the school, and so they are making their way into school through people like Amina, who represents one particular religious movement, through the teacher, who represents largely the state perspective. But on the other hand, there's also this sort of normal, everyday kind of dynamic that happen in the classroom that is even being linked to the textbook. Moderation in Islam gets linked to moderation and how you interact with your teacher, and then leads to these kind of funny events in the classroom. So all of this is to say, I mean, for me, I said earlier that as a Jordanian who grew up in the States, I had kind of a more rigid picture of what school would be like. I thought it would be stricter, I thought the kids would be afraid to do these kinds of things, but in many ways they were kids like kids anywhere, and I'm sure Ms. Jude was not happy about the unfolding of this. And then the teachers complained that the students they weren't respectful enough, that this generation was pushing in and this kind of thing. But in many ways, there was this everyday kind of just struggle. I mean, I guess we can think about struggles over authority, and in some cases, like between Ms. Suhail and Amina, it's authority to interpret religion, but in this case, it's classroom authority. And it's this very minor kind of interaction that just gives us a sense of some of the everyday similarities that we might see in the school there. And I'll say, and I found that because of who Ms. Suhail was, her class was actually one of the most interesting in terms of the possibilities, in terms of the kinds of issues that young women would bring up in the class. And in many respects, I mean, this was because it was religion class, and the kinds of issues the text did talk about. And it was this particular religion class, because they're different. So in public schools in Jordan, all students take religion, and religion is Islamic studies. There's a minority Christian population that doesn't have to attend these classes, but it's sort of a required course of the curriculum in K through 12. And this is true for most countries in the region, that religion is part of public education. And, but there were different courses. So this course happened to be, I think it was just called Islamic Learning, but this course happened to be an 11th grade course for those in the humanities track. And there were some sort of structural reasons why this class was freer and open, which is that they weren't going to be tested on it in their high school completion exam. So even though Ms. Suhail felt obligated to cover the material, there wasn't sort of a set of content that students had to learn and memorize for their high school completion exam. Unlike some of the other religion classes, which were more content-based, text-based, they were about, hadith, or they were about Quranic passages that they had to learn. So there were ways in which Ms. Suhail was critical to creating an environment which was one of the most open environments in the school in terms of what the girls could talk about and debate. So it was Ms. Suhail and her own philosophy. It was a particular curriculum, and it was where that curriculum fit in the larger curriculum that created this kind of space. And then the students, too. So all this is to say, the textbook is just sort of one tool, one sort of means, and there are all these other ways in which people are interacting with it in the classroom. The other thing I think about in the book is just sort of broader notions about morality, gender, and respectability that can't really be deduced to religion in any sense. But it's also about the sort of day-to-day negotiation about sort of what does it mean to be a young woman in Jordan today, and what does it mean to be a respectable woman. And there are some ways in which this seems quite obvious, sort of what this requires to the young women. But even on the most obvious sort of issues, there's lots of sort of tension and negotiation in the day-to-day. For me, this was most interesting in thinking about kind of the conversations about boys, love, and marriage. Because there was a very strict kind of sense that, okay, this is a girls-only school, boys were not allowed in the school, although there were always boys hanging around and trying to sneak onto campus. But there was this, the notion that boys and girls should be separate at this age in this community was quite strong, and there was particular concern about adolescents, right? Because adolescents needed to be kept apart even more than others because they're young, they're immature, but yet their hormones are raging, and they might do something they'll regret, and they might get themselves into trouble. And so there was a lot of concern on the part of the teachers and the administration to police this. They'd call a girl into the office who they'd seen in the market and say, "Who are you with?" She's like, "Oh, my brother." But there was actually this kind of policing outside of school, and the principal was very concerned that these boys who were giving her a hard time would not keep sneaking onto campus. And so and in part it was because the reputation of the school was important as well for the teachers and the girls themselves. And but what was remarkable and probably not surprising is how much the girls talked about boys, right? And I thought again that given these kind of, on the surface rules, that even if they thought about boys, which I knew they thought about them, right, and even, that they would not be sort of, that they would keep things to themselves. Like if they had a crush on the boy down the street, if they were texting with the guy who works in the cell phone, store, that this would not be something they'd be talking openly about at school, but they talked about it all the time. I mean, not all girls, and Nina would lecture them about not doing this, and other girls would be much more like they would see this as inappropriate and would never express these kind of emotions, let alone talk to a boy or let alone text with a boy. But there were other girls that were doing these sorts of things and talking about it constantly. And my absolute favorite moment in doing the research is I'm in the schoolyard, and one day Janine, an 11th grader, comes up to me, and she's got this entourage of like 7 or 8 friends, and they're walking over to me, and she says to me, "Miss, do they love in America?" And I laughed, thinking that I did many times, that there was so much that was similar about being a high school girl in Jordan and being in the United States. And I replied, "Yes, they do love in America. Do they love in Jordan?" And she said, "That's all we do." This is kind of captures, again, this is a fun and the sentiment. And there's lots in the book that's not about that fun. There's lots about the kind of trying to police these sentiments about girls getting in trouble for having a relationship that's not accepted. But there was lots of this, and movie stars, and graffiti, and pictures being tossed around classrooms. And so in that sense, and what was really interesting to me is the teachers end up being these kind of mediators. The teachers often, with the girls' best interest in mind, are saying to them, be careful about these things. Be careful about the boy who says this to you. Be careful. There's this rumor going around about these, I don't know they're called in English actually now, but this new form of marriage, which sort of historically has a precedent in Islamic law, but now there's concern about these kinds of marriages. Customary marriage, yeah, customary marriage. And so there are rumors going around that this is happening in Jordan, and it has a longer history in Egypt, and there are these very public cases that have happened in Egypt. So there are marriages that happen sort of, they're legal. I mean, there's a way in which these marriages can be legal. There are marriages that happen without witnesses, I think or it's only 2 witnesses, but you don't have sort of a public announcing of the marriage. And you don't necessarily have you don't have like a signing of a contract with a religious sheikh overseeing that. So it's sort of mutual agreement with 2 witnesses. And so this kind of marriage has always existed historically, but then there's concerns now that these marriages are used as ways for men to exploit women, so like older men to exploit women, to take advantage of them. So in any event, there were these rumors going on, and people would stop me in the street and say, "Is it true that there are all these cases of zawaj arfi at your high school?" And it was a total rumor, but these are the kinds of things that then would become subject of discussion in class. And the teachers really felt obligated to sort of help these young women kind of figure this out. They'd talk about, the religion teachers would talk about religion and what religion accepted and didn't accept, but then the other teachers would just say, you need to be careful. Usually the narrative was, men will take advantage of you. And you need to be careful not to just believe what any man says to you and this sort of thing. So in addition to the kind of, starry-eyed love talk, there was also kind of serious talk about this in the classroom and trying to mediate. And sometimes it was things they've seen on TV. They would talk a lot about what they watched on TV. People always ask me about how media and satellite is impacting these young people. It's amazing how much that is the subject of discussion. So there are ways in which that becomes interpreted or becomes sort of the meat subject of discussion within school, either because a teacher's criticizing some program and says you should be watching it, or it's a discussion about something that's happened on TV, a letter that's been written in the newspaper. So it's important kind of substance of discussion. The other point about kind of respectability, which I found really interesting, is how does education kind of change notions of respectability? And there was 2 things that I found quite interesting. One is the ways in which the tracking system really tracks respectability, right? And so there's a pretty rigid tracking system in Jordan, as there is in sort of most schools in the world, right? Almost like most countries have some kind of system like this. So after 10th grade, you get placed in a math and science track, or you get placed in like a humanities literature track, or you get to vocational ed. And this is really, and essentially what happens is the top third of the students get put math and science. The middle third get put in humanities, and the bottom third gets sent to vocational. Now Jordan has like an IT track, That happened after I left, so that I don't know where exactly that fits in there. But so what happens is that the smartest students go into math and science, and the expectation is that the smartest students should go into math and science. And there's some really interesting kind of positive effects of that. There was just a piece in the New York Times science section yesterday that was talking about the gender gap in sciences in the U.S. The U.S. has still got one of the most significant gender gaps in terms of people studying sciences, but Jordan has one of the highest rates of women studying science in the world. And in part, it's because of this tracking system in which the best students go into math and science. Now that has its own issues for those of us who study social sciences and the humanities, and so the expectation is that if you're smart, you'll do math and science, and it's not gendered in the way that it is here. So many young women go into science and study math or science. But what I saw is that there's kind of like moralizing on this that happens, right? So the smarter students are also considered just better. They're better, and there's a moral kind of language to that. They're better because they're more focused, they're devoting themselves. And this happened in the school in the ways in which teachers dealt with the Adely, like the literary humanities students, versus the Adely, the scientific track. And the students were quite cognizant of it. And they felt like they were always sort of being put down and framed as troublesome and problematic. And in part, it was linked to this idea that if they were really serious students, and if they weren't fooling around or at worst, distracted by sort of immoral things, and they would be better students because they'd be focused on their work and they'd be in math and science. And that came out actually quite explicitly sometimes from some of the teachers and even some of the students. So there's a way in which that kind of tracking system creates particular possibilities for boys and girls, and it's quite structural. And then a positive outcome of this is that more women go into the sciences, but some of the negative outcomes are that your respectability really gets tied up into your educational level. And this is true in a broader sense. I mean, women really see their education as tied to their ability to marry well, and their families see that too. And that's part of the upward mobility potential of education. If you're more educated, you're more likely to marry a doctor or an engineer, and particularly for the young women coming from poorer families, this is a great kind of possibility. This is a possibility of sort of bringing yourself up, both status-wise, but also economically, right? If you get a high enough education and you can attract a spouse, a suitor who's from a higher class, who is highly educated, and can take care of you in a way that your parents were unable to do. And the parents talked about this often too. So this kind of the tracking, I call it tracking respectability. I guess I'll just talk about my final point and then open it up for questions, because I don't want to bore you guys too much. So the last thing, the education for what was, for me, sort of what were they being taught that their education was for in school? What did these young women think that their education was providing them with, and what did their parents think? And there was quite a bit in school that explicitly addressed this. There were good school textbooks, there were like in the civic, there was a new curriculum, civic ed curriculum, that specifically talked about the changing role of women and women entering the labor force. They talked about education and the importance of education. Students and teachers talked about it all the time. There were classroom debates. They talk about some of them in the book, where they talk about whether a woman makes a good engineer or not, and whether a woman should work, and there are all these kind of debates. And then amongst families. And for me, it was quite interesting to think about around the time that I finished doing the research, and some of you may have read this article because Amina said she's assigned it, but this report came out, the Arab Human Development Report. There's a picture of it right there. And then while I was in Jordan, just the last few months I was there in 2005 for that long stretch of research, the bank did gender assessment, the World Bank of Jordan. And the message that came through in both of these reports was this idea of Jordan as, well, the World Bank one was specifically about Jordan as a paradox, and that's kind of where the title comes from. It is where the title comes from, gender paradoxes. And the paradox is high levels of education, low levels of labor force participation, high fertility. So this is being framed as a paradox in both of these reports. Like, why do women have such high rates of education in places like Jordan, but why don't we see changes in these other kind of variables? Interestingly enough, in fact, fertility is decreasing pretty dramatically in Jordan and the region. So this report was kind of behind the curve a little bit. It was a 2005 report, and there's already pretty significant evidence that fertility is decreasing for any number of reasons. But what was interesting is when, so I was asked to speak to a youth group at the Islamic Center in the city that I was doing research. A lot of my students were there, but there were other students there, and I was asked to speak to them, and I thought to myself, they never see these reports that are written about them, and they're well ranked just on the gender assessment. And I came in and I said, well, I want to tell you about this report that's been written about Jordanian women. And I said, the key kind of message is, the writers of this report are perplexed by the fact that you're getting educated, but you continue to have lots of children and you're not entering the workforce. I didn't quite put it that way, but I kind of summarized it. And it was really interesting because one of the first comments was a young woman raised her hand. She says, I don't think it's a good thing that we can have high rates of education and have lots of children. So that was the initial reaction, was like, isn't it a positive thing that we could maintain both of these? And I would not have necessarily thought about it in those terms. But in the Jordanian case, this makes total sense, right? And it meant in the sense of like the power of numbers, the importance of large families. And this is changing in Jordan as it is in many places. But in a context where there's no social security of any kind, there's no real sort of safety nets from the state, your family, your children are kind of your future security. In the not so far history too, your family was critical for your physical security. I mean, just 50, 60 years ago. So it takes a long time for this kind of shift. So having many sons was critical to protecting yourself, your family, and politically it continues to be, because the regime has historically kind of tried to manipulate these kin-based relations, and reinforce them, but at the same time sort of pit families against each other, and reinforce tribal and clan kind of identities against, in the 50s and 60s, against like more leftist kind of identities, and now against a more Islamic one. And there are particular ways in which like the electoral system is set up to reinforce clan-based identities. And to this day, your connections are critical to getting anywhere and getting most things done, and the strongest connections are familial-based ones. So in that sense, the ideology of the importance of big families and numbers makes complete practical sense in people's lives, although that's changing and numbers are getting smaller. But what was even more interesting when I gave this talk is how much debate there was about, even amongst this group of women, about whether women should work, who should be the breadwinner, and what if the husband wasn't being a good breadwinner, or what if the woman was highly educated, wanted to work, and there were quite a number of different opinions floated around, and this was very reflective of my experience in the school too. And all of the teachers at this school were products of this community, which would not have been the case 20 years ago. They all grew up in this city, and they all finished university. They were university educated, because at this point you have to be university educated, and they were teachers. So they were not sort of outsiders coming in, they were products. So the students had many models of working women in their lives, and they knew that this was sort of a possibility. But there were lots of debates about the desirability of that, about which kinds of work were appropriate, and why else one's education would be important. And education, again, is particularly for the lower income families, and most of these families in this community were sort of sort of aspiring to be middle class. And I mean, there were families in the school that were poorer than that, but many of the young women whose families I got to know had parents who had never been educated, but now had all of their children finishing high school, hoping to have some of them finish university. And education was very much about sort of the possibility of financial independence for the young women, and parents talked about it that way, but it was more about status. And it was often talked about as sort of security for young women, right? So she should be able to take care of herself should she need to. But there's still, the overall kind of sentiment is still that it's the man's primary role to be the breadwinner. But at the same time, men can't do this, and people are talking about this. Men are saying, well, the economic situation demands that men and women need to work together. So even though the numbers of women participating in the formal labor force are still quite low, there's a very strong sense that today's economic situation demands that both men and women work. And I'm hearing this from young women in 2005. I'm hearing it from people that I'm interviewing about marriage a few years, 2 years ago when I was doing this research on marriage in Jordan. And so there's a sense that a woman needs to be educated to improve her status, but also because men increasingly want to marry women who work, and because she needs to take care of herself if she doesn't get married, if she gets divorced, if her spouse dies. So it's sort of a security for women in the future. I've gone on a bit too long. Did I say, Yeah? Maybe I'll just conclude. There was a lot more I wanted to say about the kind of status and education, but you could ask me questions. I'll just conclude by saying that, my goals were this book were just to sort of complicate an oversimplified picture of youth, and particularly female youth in the region, through just everyday and kind of in-depth ethnographic looks at what life was like for these young women in schools. The other is thinking about youth, because Arab youth is something that gets thrown around a lot now, particularly post-Arab Spring, and it's very not differentiated right now. Which youth are we talking about? What class? What gender? But also we have an image of what youth is, and so a lot of the literature, even that first, a decade ago, is really focused on kind of oppositional youth movements, hip hop, youth in hip hop in the Arab world. It's youth in, but for many of these young people, their kind of goals and expectations are very much, I think the idea of them being very much embedded and wedded and sort of rooted in their own communities and families, and seeing their education and the possibilities that they're sort of pursuing as not entirely individualistic and not entirely this, or not always this project of kind of rejecting family and community. And the families, in my case, and I spent a lot of time with families, were critical to these young people, and were critical to making sure that they might be able to go on for higher education, that they might be able to finish high school. And so these families worked really quite hard to ensure that their daughters would finish school. The other thing I try to do in the text, and I didn't do as well, and I hope I do better in the next project, is emphasize the kind of structural constraints young people face. There's a lot of emphasis on culture and religion in the work on the region. But there's, again, quite a great deal that differentiates different people in the region because of where the geography, class, even the structure of the family, birth order, family history, so paying attention to the different kind of structures and histories that offer different kinds of opportunities to young people and create certain kinds of obstacles. And I would say the two areas that if I were going to examine further from this work, is this kind of underachievement of males, which is becoming a bigger problem in Jordan and several other countries in the region. Underachievement, not just in terms of completion, but even in terms of sort of the workplace and even wages. And but it's quite stark in terms of the numbers of people finishing high school. The top 10, at the end of high school, they take this completion exam that's critical to getting into university. The top 10 scorers for the past 5 years have been female. So they're overachieving all dimensions. So females are outdoing in terms of tests, in terms of completion, in terms of numbers of students in university. And you see this trend in a number of other countries. And then the other thing I think I would pay more attention to, I did pay attention to it, but I didn't frame it in terms of politics. But I feel like a lot of what I was trying to get at in the kind of authority struggles within the school is what Asif Bayat has called as like everyday politics, life is politics. And there was a lot of sort of reflection on, how did these Arab revolutions happen? How did we not see it? And folks like Bayat said that this kind of political resistance was always there, and that the most powerful kind of resistance was in this kind of everyday. We knew about the opposition movements, we knew about this, but there were sort of everyday ways in which people were regularly resisting the status quo. It's sort of hard to understand how that becomes a political movement. But for me, this was quite interesting, and I remember being just quite surprised by the young women and the degree to which they were willing to challenge the authority of teachers, challenge the authority of a test, challenge the authority. And it shouldn't be a surprise, but I feel like we reify people in the region in a way that we just, and particularly women, as passive and weak, that we don't anticipate these kinds of things, or don't categorize them or analyze them in a way that might lead us to link this to politics in a broader sense. So I'm sorry I went on a bit too long, but I'd love to hear any questions you have.
We'll take questions for about 20 minutes, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then you can just answer them. So, any questions? Always takes a minute.
Yeah. I'm curious how the girls perceive themselves. So what would have contributed to a girl feeling alienated or girls perceiving other girls as being popular? Were the reflections of the teachers similar to that of students, or were there other things that happened when you were able to observe them kind of away from that environment?
Another question?
I'm curious about how the girls responded to you being in their space, sort of how they perceived you as Jordanian, but coming from sort of a different background and how you grew up.
One more question.
You really do too well. That's good. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that part of your title around paradox is brought in. I thought your example was interesting, the one about the World Bank and the development community looking, as we know, certainly many of the people in this room know, that the relationship between education and fertility is something that's kind of widely known. And I found it very compelling, both the example you gave and the way you presented it, that sometimes this kind of development think needn't be taken as a given, that there are all kinds of varieties out there. I guess I'm wondering whether your work has led you into other paradoxical, I don't know if the right word is, confrontations perhaps with the development community based on the kind of work, the in-depth work you've done at Jordan.
So if I start with the first question, you're talking particularly in terms of like popularity, like how girls thought.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I think on the one hand, there's still this sort of culture which seems to be changing there of smart students being the popular students, which I don't know how you all experienced that as a kid, but you did not want to be known as the smart kid in high school when I was here. And you wanted to hide that with all you had. And if you were, So, but there was still this sense that smart and popular and successful, I mean, these were all sort of, and it was the students and the teachers sort of reinforced it. So there's a way in which your status as a good student and measured in really narrow ways, right? Because of this kind of rigid testing system and tracking system was very much part of your popularity with teachers, with other students. There, of course, were students who kind of took a more oppositional view to this, but the dominant sense was smart, and the smart students would always be asked to do things. So, there were supposed to be extracurricular activities here, but what the extracurricular activities usually amounted to was the Ministry of Education in Amman would contact the Ministry of Education and Wadi al-Nasim, the city that I was in, who would then contact the principals they knew they could rely on to get girls to do this project that had been mandated in the capital, and they picked the smartest students. So there's just one woman, Indira, who was always being picked for everything. She was the smartest student, very articulate, and she was picked to do almost everything. And I remember speaking to another young woman saying, I never get to do these kind of activities. They never pick me. So at the same time, there were cliques and groups, and there were the group that were more kind of risque and they pushed the boundaries on things, and there was a group that was sort of self-identified as more religious, and they spent time, this group. So, yeah, and I'm sure that changes when they get to university. I mean, they're so unsure still. I mean, it's sort of hard. I mean, even what they think education is providing them with. I mean, they're 15 and 16. So, but they were, they were the group that were really loved watching American movies, and that's what kind of brought them together. So I don't know if that answered your question fully, but. And so the next question was about how girls responded to me. I think primarily the biggest, so at the beginning, the biggest issue I had was teachers. Teachers were very worried about me in a way that any teachers are when people come into their school and into their classroom. So I kept saying, I'm not here to assess your teaching, and it took me a long time to get people comfortable with that. But they also didn't understand the research I was doing. I kept and I had kind of a broad parameter. I said, I'm interested in the social environment of the school. I kept saying it in Arabic, right? And how that affects young women. And then they'd say, give me an example. And I'd say, well, what do they learn from each other? What do they learn from, what are their relationship like with their teachers? And that was kind of my starting point. So initially I tried to get I spent a lot of time with the teachers, and in part that's because it was really cold, so I hung out in the teacher's room a lot the first month. And it's like the students weren't hanging out in the schoolyard, they were hanging out in their classrooms, and I still didn't feel, so I hung out a lot with the teachers, and then, So the students, I mean, I spent a lot the first 2 months answering questions about America, I feel like. Is it true that teenagers in America do this? Is it true that American parents kick their kids out of the house at 18? Is it true that, and it was lots of that, and I think then people got more comfortable. And they had questions for me, like, where are you from, and that kind of thing. The adults, I think, trusted me quite quickly, because my father-in-law had been an educator in this region for like 50 years. So he had educated like some of the parents of these teachers. So I had a family that I was well connected with, and so there was a sense of me being rooted indirectly that way. But they definitely saw me more as American. I should say one thing though that I think made people comfortable with me is I speak a very Jordanian Arabic, and my parents grew up in rural areas, so I speak a non-educated kind of Jordanian Arabic, or the accent is considered non-educated, right? It's come to signify non-educated rural people. But this actually put people at ease. Like I spoke to them in a way that was more similar to the way they spoke than someone coming from the capital there. And that's just the way I spoke, and it was the way I learned to speak. So that I feel like put people at ease. But I think there were some students who were suspicious, and I think there's no way to know. You end up developing a relationship with certain students. Like I tried to seek out certain students who clearly were taking on a role, but there were some who probably deliberately avoided getting to know me, and there's no way to know exactly what that did, like for my work. But I felt like people got quite comfortable and were quite open, and oftentimes, particularly the young students, like they just wanted someone to talk to. And it was very informal, and then I taught a conversation class after school, and I was able to develop relationships that way. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't pretend to think that I was totally in, but I think there were lots of ways in which I was able to make people feel more comfortable with me. So, to your question, David, so other paradoxical confrontations, like, so you were meaning, like, particularly, like, in my reading of the development literature, are there other kinds of narratives that I found? Yeah.
You know, it seems to me, I think you implied this also, that the Middle East people often have a sort of a collective characterization. Outsiders think of the Middle East as like X.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's too many kids, and they're too poor, and they're illiterate, and women get downtrodden, and all those sort of caricatures, of which you're right in the middle of gathering information on. I wonder if it has allowed you to open up that space and challenge these kind of characterizations, maybe beyond the one you mentioned,
Yeah.
but maybe in other areas as well.
I think I try to. I'll talk about a couple. I mean, definitely in my teaching, I try to. And I think they're, the Arab Human Development Report, which was produced by Arab intellectuals, right? So, and was framed as a report from within the region that would kind of rise above these, was equally, if not more, problematic than the World Bank report. And in part, this is about class, and it's about elitism, and the sort of the perceptions they have about their own fellow citizens. And I don't know if I have any friends at the Arab Human Development Report office, but so a couple of people contacted me from there. But that, for me, was also another kind of powerful example of how this is not about East-West. This is not about the World Bank and the rest of the world. This is also quite internal to the region. So that's one thing. And the other thing I would say is, I feel like the narrative of sort of weak, oppressed women is so predominant. Like, I'm not the first person to try to write something different, and there's so much more, but I am rarely surprised by giving a talk and people reading into what I've said the exact opposite of what I would hope they would get. Or even the first time I assigned an article that I'd written. But some of the other paradoxes, I have recently become more interested in the kind of political narrative about Jordan because of Arab Spring. And to me, there's this thing that gets reproduced about Jordan and the benevolent monarch. He's on Jon Stewart. We love him. He likes Star Trek. And, and there's this image, and, regardless, and we can compare him and say this is a much better regime than Syria or Iraq, and that's all true. But, there's just sort of, because he's familiar to us as an American audience, because his wife looks like God, there's a way in which people don't ask the difficult questions that need to be asked about political reform. So we take as a given that because the king says the latest election was a great reform, that it was, when in fact it wasn't really much of a change from anything that happened before. And it was probably more free, but the electoral system hasn't changed. So I've been writing a little bit about this, like why do we continue to reproduce this narrative about the political system in Jordan? Because the problem with this narrative is both, it doesn't challenge the monarchy, who's a good friend of the US and comes to the US often, it doesn't sort of push him, right, make him accountable, but it also reifies the Jordanian population as sort of complacent, accepting of this, supportive of the regime, you know, the sort of backwater that's not affected by the political events in the region. And this is also tied to lots of other issues, the Palestinian issue. I mean, there are all these ways in which it gets oversimplified. So for me, I've had kind of, my chip on my shoulder lately has been with the sort of policy think tank world and the way they write about Jordan, although it's begun to change. My work on marriage actually stemmed from the ways in which the marriage crisis, so with young people not getting married being largely framed as an economic crisis, which it is in some of its dimensions, the idea that young men can't be financially stable enough to convince young women's families to let them marry them, and they can't, like in the Egyptian case, it's a huge housing crisis, for example. But one of the things that I take up with with that kind of reading, the economic analysis, is that there are lots of other reasons why young people are it's becoming more difficult to marry. And part of it has to do with these changing gender roles, part of it has to do with the opportunity they have to actually get to know each other a little bit. There's sort of longer courtship. This is kind of like I call it the dating arranged continuum, and there's sort of lots in between. Very little that looks like dating the way we want, but it's usually not arranging in the way we imagine it. There's lots of in between, getting to know each other and brokers. And now young people increasingly have spaces to do that. So in my marriage work, I've been trying to, well, how does education impact this? How does sort of the role, you know, what are the kinds of issues that young men and women are thinking about? So that's one of the issues. And I'd say, I guess, one other thing about where I ended off on kind of like the politics of these everyday things in school is there's a lot of emphasis on things like teaching critical thinking, civic education. I mean, these countries were being heralded for teaching critical thinking. Egypt was, right? We were trying to, USA is funding all these efforts there. And, you know, I thought a lot about this as I was finishing the final revisions on this. It was, you know, summer of 2011. What does education have to do at all with the Arab Spring? And honestly, I don't think anything in terms of the content has anything to do. I think that it's sort of laughable to be trying to teach about what does democracy require in school, in a state school, when you don't live in a democracy, right? So you have a whole lesson on, you know, the gradual processes that are necessary to become democratic when you live in a monarchy, for example. And that's a huge improvement over some of the other states. So for a long time, I've thought that this whole notion of teaching people critical thinking in the region is really problematic when we're supporting authoritarian regimes, A, and B, when, in fact, what has motivated, if education is linked to the most recent events, it's in the sense that the sort of economic crisis and sort of the failed promises of education have really weakened the legitimacy of these regimes. And education is very central, I think, to these movements in that sense, and the kind of promise it was tied up with, the ways in which it wasn't fulfilled. So in that sense, one of my other issues with development is this notion somehow that these things can be taught, you know, through a particular content in school, and that this might lead to democratization, which was the implication for over the past decade, right? When in fact, I think this stuff being taught in school had nothing to, I think had very little to do with why these events unfolded. If anything, except maybe as sort of like a point of sort of paradox that people locally would point to and say, you're kidding me, right? So, obviously.
So I know that you mentioned you're interested in, but have not yet had the time to unpack questions of structure, and I think it's extremely interesting, of course, the relationship of, say, elite structures and classes and the role of education in that. And this sort of connects with some of these questions you bring up here. So I'm curious, of course, education primarily, regardless of the setting, often ends up being seen as, in some way, either providing a mechanism for mobility and opportunity and aspiration, and also, of course, through a more critical lens, as a means for reproducing the existing structures, etc. So I'm a little bit curious about that. What avenues are there within the structure for mobility from rural to urban, across classes or whatnot, just as you've seen in your work?
So I do talk about it a little bit in the book, but my sense is that You know, a decade or two ago, education really did provide possibilities, particularly for people sort of lower in that structure, for some mobility. It really, you know, could provide a leg up. I think that is increasingly not the case, but there's still people sort of holding on to that because they have few other alternatives, right? And so the bar gets set higher, for example, for government jobs, right? In terms of what degree you even need. But then you need all these connections to get those jobs. And those jobs are underpaid anyway, so increasingly they're not even the most desirable jobs. So there are a number of things going on. One is it was sort of interesting to me how much faith some of the lower income families had in this as a sort of a mode of upward mobility, as there's increasing evidence that that's not the case. The other thing is in just the past decade, you're having like a proliferation of private education. And so there's really becoming this actually multi-tiered system. You always had a handful of elite, very elite schools, but now you have many more schools, and increasingly anyone who thinks of themselves as middle class or wants to be thinks that the public schools are no longer an option. But of course, this is only in the capital, and so in the capital, 35% of students are in private schools now. And so there's this kind of multitude, and then private tutoring is becoming a huge phenomenon. It has been in places like Egypt for a long time. In Jordan, increasingly the students don't even go to school in 12th grade. They meet with tutors, and who can afford to meet with tutors, right? And the idea is that these tutors are the only way you're going to get a high grade on the high school completion exam, which you need to get into public university. Now, public universities are overcrowded, their costs are going up, and so there's a lot of sort of, even if you get into the public university, it's quite expensive. Getting to the public university, something like 50% of the students, 60 maybe, pass the high school completion exam, but a passing grade is not enough to get you into public university. Of those who pass, maybe 60% get a place in the university. What's happened is that there are these kind of parallel systems that are creating that provide you a route in with lower grades if you pay more. And so there are these parallel systems that are set up. And then there are private universities. So of course those with resources have alternatives. But this is why these families with fewer resources put so much stock in doing well in school, because there's only one route to public education, and that's doing very well on this test. And this has interesting kind of perverse effects too, right? Because it's quite rigid, and the tracking is quite rigid, if you're not a good student in 10th grade, your family, or you might make the calculation that there's no point in going any further. You're not doing well. What are the chances you're going to pass? The boys drop out and work. The girls might decide, why don't I marry this person who came by and asked about me? And so, there's this young woman who was in 10th grade when I was there, who, fell in love. I mean, they never actually interacted with a soldier who was guarding the building, next to her house, and somehow they passed messages to each other, and he came to her house and with his family, and asked about, meeting her, and they wanted to get engaged. And her thing was, I'm not a good student. I never get good grades. There's no way I'm going to do well on the TOJI, the high school completion exam. Why don't I just get married? And so here are her teachers saying, at least finish 12th grade, don't do this now. But so the guidance counselor was saying that some of the young women themselves are making this calculation, and some of the boys are, the parents consistently, parents were complaining to me. I'd say, tell me about your daughter's education, and they'd say, my daughter's doing just fine. Let me tell you about my son. And they would complain, they said, he refuses to repeat the exam. And the son's like, I'm not taking that exam again. And and then some of that is economic, so the sons feel an obligation to work. So there are ways in which I think this gender gap is explaining how people do recognize that the upward mobility is sort of false in some respects. But they're largely seeing it through this good student, bad student kind of thing. But increasingly, as you have higher unemployment of university grads, people are understanding that even the university degree doesn't do it for you. And this is a huge problem in Morocco. It's a huge problem. There's this book, Degrees of Freedom, about India. Yeah. And he looks at this exactly. He says, okay, here you have these sort of historically excluded folks who now get degrees, but they're still unemployed. So the whole reproductive argument, I think that... Well, yeah, and it's intensified in a system where very personal connections are required to get even the most basic services sometimes. So I think people, when I said it was tied to upward mobility, it's funny how that becomes a political issue, because people aren't able to move up. And they say, you've promised us this. They say to their regimes, you've promised us this possibility. And they make demands. There's an association of unemployed graduates, they're called in Morocco. They've been organized as an NGO for a couple of decades, probably, right? Jordan just created a union of unemployed graduates. They call it, so they're mobilizing as a political constituency themselves around this like entitlement, like, all right, we did this, we got here, we can't get jobs, you must give us jobs. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's just a lot of interesting kind of class structural issues here.
I think Kathy and John had a question, and then I think we have to kind of like wrap it.
Sorry, I'm talking
I
too
know it's
much.
really interesting.
So,
Yeah, I just, for the benefit of the student, I thank you for this. This is really wonderful to read the book and then to have you here to discuss.
no, it's my pleasure. It's great to have you.
I just want to follow up on Dan's question and for the benefit of the students, as an ethnographer and anthropologist, someone who's trying to trouble some of the paradoxes or the ways in which problems are framed in the World Bank as well as one of the leads in the country, etc. What kind of inroads do you think that ethnographers or anthropologists have in shaping these kinds of policy narratives or having any kind of impact? Have people listen to what you're saying or?
When my students will go on to write reports like this, and they'll remember my classes. I mean, that's the hope that I have at this point. You know, I don't know, it's funny because someone with the Arab Human Development Report actually contacted me after I wrote this article. And she said, I'd love for you to talk to my staff. And I was almost paralyzed with fear. I thought, what am I going to tell them? I trashed their report. And then I thought, well, I have to do this, right? But then she ended up leaving the post. I didn't end up talking to them. But as someone who, I mean, what I think that I need to do is sort of be speaking to that community more. And, you know, as we were just talking, now I'm up for tenure this year, and we kind of need to minimize, at least in my world, minimize those kind of activities until you publish and get tenure. But I think I definitely have some responsibility to do that, and also just to keep my own analysis fresh. Like sort of, I wouldn't feel comfortable with being involved in all the development work, but getting involved in some of it would be interesting just to keep my own kind of perspective real. But I do think there's a limit. I mean, so, and I say this in this article I wrote with the Arab Development Report, where I do this kind of analysis of the numbers and the discourse, and then I use my ethnography to say, you know, here's an example of why you can't make this sweeping generalization about families in the region. And so, and people have said to me that that was a very powerful analysis, bringing the ethnography to that kind of analysis. But I feel like, you know, when you get, and even for my students who are quite critical, I mean, there's the reality of how these institutions work, the kind of incentives that are there. And I think like something like an Arab Human Development Report is almost not possible without falling into these traps. When you're trying to write a report about an entire region, I mean, how much nuance can you bring to the analysis? So part of me feels like there's just certain kinds of certain kinds of things that we do that just aren't possible. It isn't possible to make this better. Although I signed this as in my development class last semester, I said, you've been hired to write the next Arab Human Development Report. What would you do differently? Hoping that I'd have some ideas if I get invited to go talk to them. Actually, just recently someone asked me if I'd be willing to be involved in conceptualizing a next series of reports. But in any event, so, I don't know, I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is it wouldn't hurt to do some more quantitative work myself, not in a macro sense, but like for one of the interesting things I've been paying attention to is, while I was doing marriage research, is all these women coming from outside the capital to work in the capital and live in dormitories, almost unheard of 10 years ago. They're living in kind of chaperone dormitories to work, and they're university graduates. So they're women like from 2-3 hours from the capital, small towns, villages, who've gotten degrees because education is so widespread now. They're engineers, they're math teachers, and they can't get jobs in their hometowns, and that essentially meant they wouldn't work in the past because they didn't have the kind of mobility that males did. But now you have dormitories filled with them in Amman. And part of it is economic, the economics are driving it, but part of it is this sense, well, I got educated, I should use my education, at least for now. I should use what I learned. Like this is kind of the narrative I'm getting from these young women. So for me, their stories are powerful, but it would be equally powerful to actually try and understand how many women these are. And, I may not want to do that research myself, but it might be nice to hire someone to count. But, so I think there are ways in which, because people will say, and I never want to say that this person, and in my own work, is representative. I think my goal is always the opposite, is to say, let's look at this case to understand all of the potential possibilities, that this could happen, this could happen. And it's not to say that this one is represented, because people will always ask me, well, how representative are these girls? where is this city? Are they anything like the girls in Amman? And that's never my intention, but I think it's always, I mean, like in my marriage research, I started with numbers, right? So I want to know the broader context. So I don't know if that, so part of it is my own kind of responsibility to do different kinds of work. And my teaching, which I think is a really important part of it, but maybe some more mixed methodology in my own work. But the ethnography for me is my passion. And I think it's the most powerful in terms of trying to speak to these broader narratives of oppression.
So John has the last question.
So, since education has become widespread and since you've worked in Jordan, have you seen gender relations change, and has there been a strain of any sort on the gender relations?
Yeah, I think gender relations are changing all the time. I'll start by saying that. I think there's like, things are changing all the time. Like maybe not in dramatic ways, but I think, it's just sort of inevitable that, with increased urbanization, with more education for men and women, because, Jordan had like 3 or 4 public schools before 1950. And the large majority of the population was not getting formal education, or they were seeking it in other countries and they were elite. So, they had sort of informal Quranic education, but sort of formal education beyond like the local kitab. So they had some basic literacy, but formal education is really relatively new. And so where was I learning this? So there have been lots of sort of major socioeconomic transformations, and I think it means it's sort of inevitable. So I don't know, but in what ways? In lots of different ways. And it depends sort of on the communities. Like in the marriage stuff. Well, let me go back to the core of your question, which is education. Because people will ask me, like, well, if these women get too educated, are they a threat to men? And these kinds of questions. And I think, there's, particularly in the marriage work, people would talk about this. Like, what does it mean? Getting a university education in all of my interactions with folks is not an issue anymore for a woman. She's not seen as a threat. She's not seen as, this is just sort of, in fact, this is desirable. A woman should have a university education, with some few exceptions, but so the idea of university educated is desirable. Not only is it desirable, it's what men actively seek. In fact, I didn't talk about this, but some women, like especially in kind of more arranged marriages, will actually negotiate that the man has to pay for the rest of her undergraduate education as part of the terms of their marriage contract. And in some cases, you must pay for my master's degree. So in this negotiation between families. And in many instances, men see this as to their advantage. It's a status issue, it's an economic issue. But there is this, amongst women, a concern and their families, right? If you go on for like a master's degree, you delay your marriage too long. Does this decrease your marriage prospects? And it's less framed as you're too smart and more like the longer you prolong getting married, the less likely you get older and it's harder to get married. So the way in which I see it framed as problematic for women is delaying marriage decreases your chances of marrying. And there's a broader kind of fear, like so there's all kinds of like discourses of divorce rates are skyrocketing. Spinsterhood is a huge problem. So this idea that there are all these unmarried women unable to get married, and this circulates throughout the region. And from the numbers I've seen, you do have a sort of slightly increasing number of single women, but it's not that dramatic. It's like over 50 years, but there's a sense that it's the case. And I saw some interesting data recently, which is about 20 to 30% of marriages in the last 10 years involved women who had higher degrees than men. So this is to say that the degree itself is not sort of preventing these kind of relationships from happening, but at the same time, there's all kinds of everyday conflict, right? I work all day, why don't you help around the house? And it's still seen as primarily the woman's responsibility, almost entirely. So on a kind of just ideological level, if you're going to work, you still have to make sure you do your take care of your primary responsibility, which is the home and the kids. But at the same time, there's all this in the day-to-day negotiation, and there are plenty of men who realize that they need it, and they see it as helping their spouses in the same way that most women still see it here, most men still see it in the United States here. But like here in the United States, it took 60 years to narrow the gap, right? So I just looked at some data recently. Women still do more domestic work than men, so women who are full-time employed and men still do more than men, but the gap has decreased significantly since the 1960s. And I think about this in the context of Jordan, right? Because people will say, oh, the men don't do anything, but I think in the everyday, the ideology is it's her responsibility, and if she can't take care of the house, then she should not be working outside the home. But the reality is in day-to-day, there's all kinds of struggle about it, but also cooperation. There's sort of ways in which people are trying to deal with it. I think, you know, the kind of idea of an educated woman is accepted totally. The question is, what do you do with that education? That's what becomes more a question of debate. Like, you know, can you take care of your children and do this? Is this an appropriate workplace for you? Those are more the questions. The question about being educated, the only debates I really hear is, should you do a PhD? But I hear those debates here too. Because that's like really prolonging it. You may never marry, you may never have kids, you know, you might, what are you going to do with it? You know, these kinds of questions.
So I'm sure you all had lots of other great questions, but we're going to have to end right now. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.